Do you love the smell of napalm in the morning? Then you should read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And before we get to the review, we're going to answer one question. Did I enjoy reading this book? And the answer is yes. Hey guys, welcome to Whiskey and Literature. I'm your host, Captain Mike. I am reading and reviewing 52 books in 52 weeks in 2023. And while I'm turning those pages, I'm sipping those bottles of finely distilled spirits. This is my 27th book review of the year so far, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I'm excited about this review, more than just for the book, but we're going to welcome back again a return guest reviewer, Stephen. Welcome to Whiskey and Literature again.
Thank you. Glad to be here again.
Yeah, well, you're back by popular demand. You did so well last time. Everyone, I do actually really enjoy these two-person interviews and reviews. I think it's more dynamic and it's funner for the reader. For the watchers there, get more perspectives. And so I'm happy to have you back.
I agree with you. I really liked watching the video that you did with Max several weeks ago. I thought it was really interesting, his input.
Group.
Yeah, he was awesome.
I agree with you.
We're in contract negotiations right now to see if he'll come back for another one.
I'm sure he's negotiating hard.
Yeah, he wants a piece of the revenue.
Yes,
Oh.
Yeah, we all do.
Well, as of now, the revenue would be you paying me. This is costing me quite a bit of money. So
yeah, well, yeah. YouTube's not
Despite the fact that
coffers.
if you watch my video, you might have to have watched an ad or a commercial, which you skip. But Captain Mike's not getting into that money yet. So and whatever. It's not the whole point. The idea here was going to read 52 books in 52 weeks, and I'm blazing through these books. I think I'm pretty much on schedule. And I just wanted to share my journey with YouTube. And do I care about making any money from YouTube? No, not really. So, but I just hope everyone enjoys these the videos. I know when I watch videos, I prefer when there's a couple guys or a couple people talking and working off each other. I think it's more interesting. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, I agree with you. And it's interesting to watch all the different reviews you do, just because when I first saw the list and heard about the 52 books, I figured they'd all be books I'd never heard of. Maybe a couple from high school, but there's a good handful that obviously I've read one or two now. But I think I've actually read a couple more than that and heard of several more than that. So,
yeah,
I don't consider myself a big book person, but I think everybody knows at least some of the books on this list.
Absolutely. Who's not heard of Huckleberry Finn and Moby Dick and War and Peace? Maybe Heart of Darkness is under the radar, and everyone's heard of Jane Eyre and the big classics. But probably half of these books on my list I had never heard of this year, or I had never heard of in my life. And I do consider myself a reader, which is why I watched. If you haven't watched any of Benjamin McAvoy, it was hardcore literature. I watched his YouTube when we came back from Barcelona last year. That was the inspiration for reading these books this year. That's where I first saw the list of the 50 greatest books of all time, and I added 2 more. So
cool.
Yeah, so everyone should go check out Benjamin McAvoy's channel, Hardcore Literature. It's very informative. I've learned quite a bit from watching his channel. But Heart of Darkness, and I think you read it in high school, this is one of the 2 books I think on the list that I tried to read and I didn't get through it. And I might have started, because the book is in with 2 other books. There is Youth, Heart of Darkness, and The End of the Tether, or something like that. I'm talking about. Did you read those ones?
I don't think I have, and if I did, I didn't realize it. I didn't really see. There was definitely a 4 word in the book, and I don't know what those 2 things are. And I will say, like, even reading this in high school and then reading it recently, I still feel like there's a lot that I missed, that it was just a really tough book to dissect. So I can't even clearly say yes or no I didn't read those, because I don't even know. Maybe I did. I doubt I did, though.
I think when I tried to read this before, I read the whole foreword and then Youth, and I don't think I even got to Heart of Darkness, to be honest with you. But we'll talk about what you just mentioned about getting into the book and dissecting it and really understanding it when we talk about our thoughts and stuff. But let's talk about Joseph Conrad just briefly. And I do think it's important for people who are reading these classics and maybe delving into the classics for the first time to understand where the author is coming from. Many times the authors, and we'll talk about Joseph Conrad, he wrote A Heart of Darkness, and he, like many of the other authors of the books that I'm reading this year, and most authors in general, except maybe sci-fi guys, they drew from their life experience to, as the inspiration for many parts of these novels. Polish-born British author. He was born in 1857, died in 1924. As he did novels and short stories, and Heart of Darkness was not actually a translated book. He wrote it in English, but that wasn't his original language, which is why earlier you were saying something about, the structure of the book and the language. And that's probably why that is, because, he is not a native-born English speaker. And he lived in occupied Poland, spent some time in the French and British merchant marines or merchant navies. And that was an important thing because part of those experiences is formed the Heart of Darkness. So anything about Joseph Conrad at all? Did you look at him? Or
I do remember seeing his Polish name and the similarities to Joseph. It's basically Joseph Conrad is kind of the English version of his name.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I'd forgotten that until now. You and I were talking before about how the language in the book isn't really colloquial modern English, but it's not like a traditional Victorian English, because I think I had mentioned that I had read this book through, or listened to it through an audiobook this time around, and I didn't feel like I felt like the voice author had done a pretty good job with the reading.
Great, let's get to that in just a second. We'll start with these specs and stats and just quickly about his name. I mean, again, a lot of these authors that I'm reading, like Leo Tolstoy, his name isn't Leo Tolstoy. I mean, that's the Americanized version of that. And quite a few of these authors who are the Russians specifically, and they kind of Americanize their names. And even those who are English, they use not necessarily a pen name, but in some instances they do, just kind of easier to remember. But Heart of Darkness was first published in 1899 in a 3-part serial. It was released in book format in 1902. It didn't actually do very well by itself. It didn't do very well during Joseph Conrad's life, but it was placed in a collection with 2 other stories, Youth and The End of the Tether. And then it gained more traction after that. And this is considered a novella, and I don't think there's necessarily a definition of novella, but it's longer than a short story and shorter than a novel. So
that makes sense
whatever
to
that,
me. Wow.
Whatever that is. So I think there's 214 pages in my book, and I have the same book that you do, I know, because I bought both the copies that we have, and it's the same exact book. But Heart of Darkness is only 74 pages long out of this 214 pages. So pretty short story. I think that is the shortest book that I'm reading this year. And I did, like I said, I tried to read this years ago twice and didn't make it through either time. And I didn't listen to it at all on Audible, but you said you listened to it in audiobook format this time.
Yeah, it looks like it was 4 hours and 40 minutes.
Okay. Time. And do you remember who the narrator was, what his name was?
His name is Alan Monroe. And like I said, I felt like he did a pretty good job for, I guess we can talk about it more, but the dryness.
No, let's talk about right now. So what did you think about how, I mean, because to me, the narrator sometimes in the books make the book. And just as a quick side note, I'm listening to Catch-22 right now, and I tried to read that years ago. I also couldn't get through it. And I'm telling you, the viewer, do not read Catch-22. Go to Audible, download the version that he reads, and that's the only way to experience Catch-22. He's freaking amazing, and that review will be coming up pretty soon. But okay, so
well, that's interesting, because I feel like Catch-22 is a book that we also read in high school back in the 2010s, 2010s.
Okay.
But I'd never read that one either.
In Utah, so there's no way we would have read Catch-22 in high school, man. I mean, I couldn't even get through it, I think, the first time because I was pretty active Mormon, and, it's just, there's quite a bit of sexual innuendo, and not just even innuendo, but just, it's not very explicit, but it's talk about bouncing body parts and whatnot, and it's just, it would not be appropriate for an active Mormon person. So I would not have read this in high school.
Yeah, I feel like it was an high school option, maybe in the public schools, but like I said,
Heart of Darkness you did read in high school, and you annotated it and all that sort of stuff.
Yep, I still have the copy with a bunch of pencil notes in it. I didn't dive in too deep this time around because I wanted to give the audiobook a try, but my high school memories were of just like kind of begrudgingly reading this book and annotating it for the course credit. I really kind of lost myself in the story, and not in like the good way. My first impression of this book, and spoiler alerts or whatever, that I just felt like this guy was on this never-ending river, and there wasn't even that much action. Like, it was just, he's going up a river and it's not a good scenario, and he's never gonna get to this guy that he's looking for.
Yeah.
Eventually the book finally ended, but it felt like a 24-hour car ride of just waiting.
Yeah. I can't imagine enjoying this book in high school. I really can't. I imagine, and I've always thought of you as a mature kid, but even then, I couldn't imagine reading this book in high school and in any way enjoying this story.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Now, and one last speck and stat, and of course, my heart of, my napalm in the morning snark there. This book was kind of the inspiration of the movie Apocalypse Now. I mean, that's set in the Vietnam era, whereas it's set in the African continent in the 1800s. So it's a very, very different story, but same kind of gloomy madness and all that sort of stuff. So if you weren't aware of that, you are now. Let's see, style. It is a novella using a frame story, and it's considered colonial literature. Do you know what I mean by frame story?
I don't.
So a frame story is like, so we have Marlowe, who is the main character in the book, and he's in England in the book. He's actually with some other co-workers on a boat in the, how do you say it, the Thames River. They're moored there, and they're just moored there in the middle of the river, and he's telling the story to those who are with him on the boat of when he became a riverboat captain in the African jungle going up a river. So that frame story is him in the boat telling his co-workers this story.
Yeah, so I love that in the beginning. I thought that was unique and almost like a Disney kind of child's movie where it's like your grandmother's reading you the story and then you get sucked into the story almost.
Yes, absolutely. And I just finished 1001 Arabian Nights, which was a fantastic read, and it also was a frame story. And actually, I'd never even heard of that until I did 1001 Arabian Nights. You had this the story of the king and queen, and so she, to not get her head cut off, she's telling the king stories every night. And so the whole book is just these different stories, but the stories that the queen's telling the king so he doesn't kill her. So it was really, really well done.
Interesting.
I would say the frame story is kind of a minor part of this book, but it is an interesting. It's also a critique of imperialism. We talk about evil, madness in the book. So that's kind of the themes and the style of the book.
Almost a similar theme to the other book review that you invited me on for Gulliver's Travels, where he kind of made light of maybe not colonialism directly, but he made light of how do you say, like the empire of Europe, and imperialism. Exactly. Kind of made light of that, and so in this sense, it's kind of a similar theme of highlighting the evil or the dark side of colonialism.
Yeah, 100%. And I thought it was really well done. And again, I keep going back to all the other books that I'm reading, but a lot of them are critiques of the government and the policies of their day. Tristram Shandy, I didn't enjoy it at all, but it was really a critique of all that stuff that was going on. The church and the government, Midnight's Children, it was a critique of when Britain, actually we're talking about Britain here today, also colonialism, when Britain like relinquished control of India and Pakistan in Midnight's Children. And so it was just, and how that thing just went sideways. But it's a pretty frequent thing, I think, not necessarily imperialism, but the governmental policies of the day. So very interesting. And some of that even really applies to today as well. So, well, good.
Very punk rock, very in line with things like, I would say 1984. It's kind of a modern version of these things.
Yeah, still applies 100%. There's not one thing in 1984 that isn't happening right now, I don't think. But that was a great read. All right, let's talk about the characters real quick. We're just gonna name them and then get to the plot of the book. So we got Marlowe. He's the main character in the frame story. He's telling his story to his co-workers. We have Kurtz, and he's already in the jungle. He's the guy that Marlowe ends up trying to go see, and he's in charge of an ivory trading post. We have a couple minor characters. I think the Russian trader who was at Kurtz's camp already, and when Marlowe gets there, he comes on the boat. He was a pretty minor character, but he was there. We have the general manager from, when Marlowe gets to the jungle the first time, he gets off the steamer that took him to the mouth of the river. He meets the general manager of the, I don't know, it's some barrack-like buildings. It must be where like everyone who's going upriver stops there, gets outfitted, and then they leave. Yeah. There was a brickmaker who, minor characters, and he was at the encampment where the ship that Marlowe was supposed to take upriver was at, and we'll talk about him briefly. We have Kurtz's intended, and she was back in Britain or wherever, and Marlowe visited her at the very end of the story. And then one of my favorite characters, No Name. She was the wild and barbarous woman with tawny cheeks. I thought she was just there for a couple paragraphs, but I've been puzzling over her for quite a while. Let's talk about who our favorite characters are when we get to our thoughts. But any other characters I didn't mention that really piqued your interest?
No, I think you've hit all of them. I do feel like you've listed more than I even remember. It's like, again, it's kind of hard for me to follow this story, and I do remember these things, but it's not like I remember sequentially this book very easily. It's very hard for me to visualize this story.
It's kind of a gloomy book. I don't know how long it took you to listen to it. I think I read a book in a day this time.
I listened to it probably in 3 sittings.
And it's been a couple of weeks since I finished it. I was at work yesterday, and I just basically flipped through all the pages as I getting kind of ready for today, and marking up a couple of spots and just reading a couple of paragraphs about a couple people, a couple of the minor characters, and we'll talk about them again when we get to our thoughts that I thought were just kind of interesting. But all right, I'm going to blaze through the plot, just kind of help refresh your memory, and then let's just talk about the book and what our thoughts were. So we have the plot. We have the frame story. We have an older Marlowe, and he's moored in the Thames River, and he tells the story of how he became a riverboat captain to the other guys who are with him for the ivory trading company in the jungles of Africa. So when he's young, he's infected with the wanderlust early, and he wants to know what's in the gaps of the maps. And he uses his aunt's influence to secure himself a position with the ivory trading post. And she helps him because she thinks he's going to bring Jesus to the savages of Africa. So he takes 30 days on a steamboat to get to the mouth of the river. And while he's going up there, they're kind of going along the jungle. And there's a man of war, which is just firing a cannon fusillade into the jungle. And he's just like, that's just kind of weird. Like, he didn't see any houses or people or anything. It's just firing into the jungle. And it just became one of the many strange occurrences that he saw. When he gets ashore at the mouth of the river there, he sees a chain gang of guys who have a bunch of dirt and baskets on top of their head. They're all chained together and they're walking along. And he just kind of wanders around and he comes up to what he called a dying field. It's just people there who had been working and they just wandered there to die. Okay, and then while he's there at the encampment, he meets the chief accountant, who was an interesting character in his own right. And that's the first time we hear about Kurtz, because the chief accountant mentions Kurtz to Marlowe and says that Kurtz is like an amazing guy who will go far. And he actually tells Marlowe, hey, when you get there, make sure you tell Kurtz I'm doing everything that I can. And he was at that station for a day or two, and then it's just crazy to me. Like, I think about our lives, but he just left the station with 60 guys in a caravan to go walk 200 miles with 60-pound packs on them through the jungle on what was referred to as a well-beaten path. It said, I think it took him 15 days. So 15 days to walk 200 miles with 60 pounds on your back through the jungle. I found that pretty astounding. I mean, that's more than 10 miles a day. 15 miles, 12, 13 miles a day. I'm pretty sure I couldn't do that for 15 days. So then he gets there after this journey just to find that the boat that he's supposed to take upriver is at the bottom of the river. So he spends 2 or 3 months lifting this boat up out of the water, repairing the boat before he can even begin his journey up the river. Mm-hmm. And that's where I stopped. Okay, so now we're just going to summarize real quick the rest of the book, of the plot. So he gets the boat up off the river bottom, they get it repaired, and he starts motoring up the river. And the book is just so crazy. It's kind of like The Trial in a sense by Franz Kafka, in a sense that it's in some ways not complete, but it's a novella, and that's why, right? We don't get all these fleshed out details about their day-to-day, what's going on. We get little glimpses of this journey for that up the river to Kurtz's encampment. And he keeps hearing things about Kurtz. He hears that he's ill. He hears that maybe he's gone a little crazy or something. No one doesn't really know what's going on with Kurtz. All they know is that Kurtz delivers. As far as the idea is sending ivory down and sending ivory back over. And Kurtz, he delivers the ivory, so no one really cares what's going on beyond that. So Marlowe, as he's journeying up the river, for some reason, some of the some of the natives on the boat with him are cannibals. I don't remember, but they were attacked once or twice. One of his second mate or first mate, one of these guys actually gets killed, and he's concerned that the cannibals are going to eat him, but they don't. He finally gets to Kurtz's encampment, and that's where the Russian trader comes on the boat. Yeah, so Marlowe finally ends up there at Kurtz's encampment, and things just go crazy. We meet the Russian trader. We meet the wild and barbarous woman with the tawny cheeks. Kurtz comes out on is the word plinth, where he's like on a kind of like a little chair, and they're carrying him out to him. He comes on the boat, and then he tries to escape, and then he chases him, and he gets him back onto the boat. And it's just kind of a weird, chaotic scene. There's spikes with heads on it. It just seemed kind of very, very chaotic and crazy, kind of like in the Apocalypse Now scenes where things are just slightly insane. And so then they make it back down the river. Kurtz, well, he dies on the river on the way back. And the story just almost kind of ends right there as far as the jungle goes. He gets back down the river. He gets back to back to Britain, and he meets Kurtz intended. And I mean, it's very, very, very quick story. All right, so that's as far as I'm going to get into the plot, basically. Just know the rest of the book is crazy insane. And if you want to know what happens specifically, just read the book. Guys, it's only 74 pages long. You can read that in one sitting. That was on my short that I put out for 5 classics you can read in one sitting. Link to that in the description below. And while we're at that, I mean, have you read Heart of Darkness? Have you seen Apocalypse Now? I mean, this is not like the kind of movie or the kind of book that people read for fun, I don't think. But anyway, I think you should read Heart of Darkness, and comment below if you have. Give me a thumbs up if you have. All right, let's talk about our thoughts of the book. And it was kind of a crazy book, and I have some notes here and a couple of quotes. And so I don't know if you remember when Marlowe was first on the boat talking to his co-workers about the trip, and he was talking about the Romans. You remember
I
that?
don't remember the scene with the Romans. I do remember his feeling of how strange it was of an expedition, especially when he, I think, first got hired by the company, or he was in their offices back in Britain. How the way everyone treated him, because this is obviously such a different expedition of just getting ivory from Africa versus, I don't know what to compare it to, but.
Okay, yeah. That whole.
What's with the Romans? What?
Okay, what he was talking about, I think what he was doing was he was comparing the British colonialism, the imperialism, the forays into Africa to when the Romans first landed in Britain. And I got a couple quotes there. And he referred to the Romans, their conquest of not just Britain, but everywhere, as robbery with violence and aggravated murder on a great scale. And I think he was comparing his time in Africa to the Romans landing in Britain. And a little more specifically in this, with the same kind of sequence or scene, he refers to, imagine he calls it a decent young citizen in a toga, landing in the darkness, he calls it, of Britain back in the day. And as that young, decent citizen spends more time going through Britain and this darkness, he talks about his growing regrets, the longing to escape, the powerless disgust, the surrender, and the hate. And I think he was really talking about the Romans, because he probably thinking about this all these years. But I think really he was talking about himself and his thoughts as he was going on this journey. I think he was so excited to start out on the journey, and as it was just going along, his heart and his just grew heavy with this darkness and madness. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting to think about from that perspective, and I guess that's a great reason why we need to, when we really read books, is to understand the perspective of the narrator or the character, because I think a lot of people can relate in just different ways. I definitely remember that part of the book, and it's reminding me of this music group that they kind of narrate some songs in German. And because I can understand German, I learned German, this story is very interesting because it's about a Roman legion fighting Germanic peoples way back in the day, when the Germanic people were like almost Viking-esque. They were just murdered the Romans, and and it's a fun little song story about this battle that they have. And it's like a continuation of the colonialist or the aggressor or the invader. Or the invader story is an ancient story, so you could put yourself in the shoes of many different cultures, and people can see the invader perspective through their own eyes.
Yeah, and we still see it today. Right now we see in Europe and Asia, we see great superpowers, invading smaller countries and for the resources that they have. And you're right. Through the beginning of history, you got it, I want it, so here I come. Whether that's resources, salt, fishing grounds, you have women, I need to make more babies and grow my country, whether it's access to waterways or whatever it happens to be. Man, if you could take it, back in the day, you did. Aggravated murder on a great scale. And I can't even imagine being in that situation where you're doing this sort of thing. And I think it's portrayed really well in here. And let's go back to what you were saying earlier in the very beginning of the story, when he gets when he finally gets his commission or whatever you want to call it, and he goes to the company headquarters. He goes through that whole sequence where he the the two ladies, and the director, and then the doctor. So let's go back to characters real quick. Do you have a favorite character or someone who was interesting or the most interesting character to you?
I felt like Marlowe, the main character, was the most interesting, but the most interesting part about him was his, and maybe it's because the author, like you discussed earlier, was Polish British. It almost takes an immigrant to break free of like a really nationalist, like pride in your country. Like, and Marlowe was interesting because he wasn't some British guy who just loved the crown and just thought that they were rightfully taking ivory from these savages, was a little more critically thinking. I think the most interesting part of Marlowe was his obsession with Kurtz at the end, which I don't really understand that or why he was so obsessed with this person he'd never met but only heard about.
Again, I don't understand that. I agree with you. And I think that's part of the mystery, and that's part of I want to say, an allure of the novella, and where we have this kind of a sketch of a story, and you get to fill those pieces in, make it into your own understanding or conception from your point of view, what was happening, as opposed to this could have been a 600-page book. I mean, for this entire journey, we could have gotten more detail about the journey with the caravan through the jungle, more detail into Marlowe's minds and what his thoughts were, and why he was so obsessed with Kurtz. And Kurtz, for someone who he was obsessed with, was a very, very small part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and part of me feels like maybe he was looking for camaraderie, somebody he can maybe relate with. He was probably hoping that Kurtz maybe would be like him, or like a figure that he could look up to.
Yeah.
Or maybe just a pillar of sanity as he goes up this jungle into a world that he understands less and less. Maybe Kurtz to him was like a light in the heart of darkness.
Yeah, or maybe Kurtz was the heart in the heart of darkness. I don't know. I mean, maybe he was where all that, the darkness, you could refer to several different things. I mean, what do you think the heart of darkness referred to? I mean, the jungle, the madness while you were in the jungle, the obsession that Kurtz had, and I guess you could interpret the darkness to be whatever you want.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. I mean, because Kurtz wasn't together, an Englishman would have looked at him and say he's lost it or something, at the end.
Yeah.
So
we're talking about characters. There were three characters that stood out to me that was super kind of just interesting and weird. And first was the two old ladies who were knitting outside the director's office in the headquarters. I mean, what was up with those two ladies? I mean, I don't even understand, they weren't secretaries. They were just sitting in chairs knitting when he walked into the director's office. I don't think they were related to the director or the company guy, whoever that was. They just were there knitting. They said some words to him and just kind of looked at him strangely and with knowing smiles or, expressions, and we don't know anything about them. It was just, I think we have quite a few of these characters kind of like those two ladies, where we just get brief glimpses of them. It's kind of an odd meeting, and then we just don't see them again. Think about the bricklayer. So when he gets to this place where his ship was sunk and he had to lift up, do you remember the bricklayer? I mean,
I remember the ladies, but I don't remember the bricklayer.
The bricklayer, I mean, he probably had less than, or the brick maker, sorry. I think he had less than a paragraph worth of the story, but he's out in the middle of this jungle. His job is to make bricks, but there's no brick making materials in the jungle. So he doesn't do anything. He's just there.
Oh, yeah.
Doing nothing because he's a brick maker with no materials. So I was just like, all right, that's kind of weird. Just kind of another odd occurrence. Those two ladies are knitting, and then there's a brick maker. The wild and barbarous woman with tawny cheeks. I had to look up what tawny means. So I was like, okay, is she a native that Kurtz has gone native? And Do you remember the wild and barbarous woman? She, when Marlowe gets to Kurtz's camp, and he uh, he gets Kurtz, and Kurtz comes on the boat, and the natives come to the shore of the boat, or to the shore, and they're kind of menacing. And all of a sudden, there was like a silence among the crowd, and this wild and barbarous woman came out, and she just walked back and forth, and she raised her arms, and she screamed, and she was described as having her hair done up like a helmet, and her arms are full of bracelets and anklets, and she never said a word. She was just there. She walked back and forth. She yelled. Then everyone started yelling, and then she wandered away. And then when they were sailing away, she came out to the shore again, and then she was gone. I mean, was she Kurtz's woman? Was she a lover? Was she his second in command? It's just another odd occurrence, just another odd character that I just found fascinating. Like in a real book, you would have some backstory and know who she is. You would know what those old ladies were doing, and like small little people there. And even the chief accountant, when he first lands there and he's talking to the chief accountant, this guy's been in the jungle for 3 years, and he walks out with his perfectly coiffed hair, his starched shirt that's spotlessly white, stiff collars, beautiful cuffs, and he's just all done up, in the middle of this jungle after 3 years. And I found it interesting that Marlowe asked him, dude, how do you look so good? And he says, well, I got one of the native women to take care of my clothes, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but he's like, she didn't really want to do it. She took some convincing to get her to take care of my clothes. And I think just that offhandedness, basically talking about violence, I feel like that's what I understood that to mean. He was like, I had to force her to, be subservient. And I think that's part of the book. It's just kind of this offhanded violence. And if you think about the boat as he's steaming to the mouth of the jungle, that man of war is just firing into the jungle. That's also an odd scene, because it's like they mentioned that the sailors on that ship were basically dying at a very quick rate, and they were just firing. And as far as Marlowe could tell, to no effect. They're just firing their cannons into a jungle that looked like any other part of the jungle. Just another odd kind of off-kilter experience, I think, that keeps the reader like, okay, I'm reading this. Was that an important, like if you read this in a real book, like a larger story, I would read something like that. I'm like, okay, I would know in a couple chapters that scene was going to lead to something, because they don't put things in books and movies unless it leads to something. But there were just odd people and experiences in this book that didn't lead to anything. It just kind of kept me off kilter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, almost like he was really a fly on the wall, and not in the sense of like he's where the action is happening and he's figuring out all the things, but literally that he was just a fly on the wall, and he was just there observing bits and pieces of this.
Yeah, because really he didn't do anything.
River.
I mean, he didn't do anything. I mean, he was a captain of the riverboat when they went up to Kurtz's place and then brought them back. And really, in some respects, the greatest thing that he did, is when they were firing the arrows at the boat, and he let off the whistle, and the whistle for some reason totally scared the natives away, and they stopped and ran away. But other than that, he was a fly on the wall for the whole story, pretty much. So
yeah.
Do you think Joseph Conrad was a racist? Is that a loaded question? I mean, do you think this book is? Do you think this book itself is racist? Because there is some controversy regarding this book that it's a racist book.
I would say it's an observant book. It's hard to talk about racism, especially if you consider that this was an author who was born and died before the Second World War even took off. I think everyone agrees that colonialism was kind of maybe the beginning of racism. I don't know if the book in itself is racist as much as it was observant of and maybe realistic to just the things that were happening at that time, good or bad. I wouldn't just label this book as a racist book. I think it's a historical fiction based on terrible things that happened, and I think everybody's wise to think more critically about things as opposed to just saying this book is racist or this book is not racist.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I can see why people could level that charge in, maybe not that Joseph Conrad was a racist, but that the book itself is racist. I mean, it does portray the native Africans as wild and barbarous, but I think that's just how they were viewed in that day.
Certainly from the eyes of an Englishman who was impressed by someone who starched his shirt,
Yes.
It might have been a couple hundred years ago, but these guys were city slickers. Maybe if he was like a Scottish farmer, he would have seen things through different eyes. But I mean, even a Scottish farmer, I feel like was drinking tea and had a certain standard of living.
Yeah.
So that would have made tribal people or hunter-gatherer people just the first thing you think is like, these are wild savages.
Yeah.
So it's just a perspective that someone would have had then, racist or not.
I agree, and I think it's a book worth reading. Like I said, it's a pretty easy read, and I don't think it's for everybody. We'll talk about it in the star rating real quick, but
yeah,
it's a book it's not like Jane Eyre or some fun book, and you read it and you're like, oh, it's
it's hard to personalize yourself. It is quite a downer, but it's hard to personalize yourself. Like you said, it maybe not be for everyone. Like, I don't feel like if you were growing up, like, what books should you read? Like this book. If you were interested in colonialism, definitely a book you should read. Can you think of? I can't think of anything else, like any other situation or person I would recommend this book to.
Maybe someone really likes Apocalypse Now, and that's like their favorite movie, and so they want to see the inspiration for that. I think it's a pretty good example of a novella. So, and it's a fair example of a frame story. So if you want to see that type of structure of a novel. So, any other thoughts on the book?
Nope. I think I've already told you my star rating, what that would be. But
tell everybody else. So what do you think? What would you rate this book as?
I'd give it a solid 3. And I think that might be a little generous, just because I don't think I'll ever read it again. And the first time I read it in high school, paperback, I just dreaded it. And then here, just recently reading it or listening to it, I know a little more now than I did then, and I still just kind of listened to it and just was hoping that it would end sooner than it would.
That bad, huh? Okay.
Yeah, which makes it sound like I should give it a 1 or a 2, but it was maybe not gripping, but impactful. Like you said, I mean, it was a gloomy book, and I certainly still feel that way about it. And interesting, I do find it interesting to see from a perspective that colonialism was largely evil or harmful. Through that lens, I found it interesting.
I really haven't assimilated or really thought deeply about colonialism and imperialism, and I'm not even willing to say it's inherently evil or definitely terrible things were done. Just a different world back then, I think, than from now, and that's not excusing them in any way in the things that they did. But okay, well, thanks for your thoughts on that. And so you're a solid 3.0, and you think that's a little generous. Is that what you're standing on?
Generous 3, yes.
Generous 3. Okay. Well, I'm going to give my star rating now, and I judge all my books on 5 criteria, 6 if I listen to it on Audible, and I didn't listen to this book at all on any audiobook format. So here we go. First, initial response. How do I feel as soon as I finished the book? And I gave it a 3. And it's a gloomy story, but I think it was well done. 2 recommendation. How likely am I to recommend this book? We just mentioned that. I only gave it a 2 because it is not for everyone. And so I don't really know many people who would want to read this book. So 2. 3, style. Did I enjoy the writing style? And I'm gonna give it a 4. I did like the frame story. I don't mind books that move along fast sometimes. I think it was well done. Plot and structure. How engaged was I in the story? I also gave it a 4. I did like the story. I didn't like it when I read it years ago. I didn't even finish it. But this time it is a mature story, and well, I'm getting older. So I did enjoy it. I wanted to see what was going on. So it got a 4. And characters, number 5. Were they relatable, believable, engaging? And you know what? I gave this a 5 for the characters, believe it or not. Maybe I wish they were more fleshed out, but I thought they were interesting. And in some respects, I don't mind that they weren't fleshed out because I can imagine them how I want. And that's kind of fun as a reader. So 5 for the characters. Okay, that's 18. And 18 divided by, let's see, 5 is 3.6. So 3.6 stars for Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And I think that's a fair score from me to give to this book. I think well done, Joseph Conrad. All right, guys. Well, huge thanks to you, Stephen. I know we had a little scheduling difficulty. I think we both finished this book a while ago. And so I'm glad we could finally connect and do this. And so welcome back, and thanks for joining with me today.
Yeah, glad to do it. Always happy to do it. It's good talking to somebody else about the things we read. So
yeah, it's fun. As I go to work, sometimes they see me typing, and I really haven't told anybody at work about what I'm doing, but they'll see me typing some stuff as I'm referring to a book, and they're like, "What are you doing?" Like, "Oh, I'm just." It's like, "Are you writing a book report?" Like, yeah.
That's a good. I mean, you are.
Yeah, I mean, really, it is. That's what I tell guys. I'm doing a book report, and I mentioned a couple of times, like, oh, I'm reading a lot of books this year, and my kids have read a couple of the books with me, so we're just going to talk about it, and so it's kind of fun. Well, thanks for sharing your time with me. All right, guys, and for you, if you enjoyed the video, like it. It's free. Subscribe to see more of my content. If you would like, I do both book and whiskey reviews this year. And for now, I hope you are reading something good and drinking something great, my friends. Cheers. Scotch. The Glenlivet 14.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah.